Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome to today's machine learning community event, to those in the room and those watching online. My name is Alex Blanton. I work in the Cloud AI Platform group, and part of my job is putting together community events where Microsoft employees can learn from one another and share insights and experiences and knowledge. So the machine learning community has about 6,000 members worldwide, so it's a lot of people. We do a wide range of events. The biggest event that we do is the Machine Learning, AI, and Data Science Conference, which we run twice a year. Is anyone planning to attend the conference next week? Well, let's see Bill there. Speaking there, right? So a few people are attending, that's great. Yeah, we hold that event twice a year to bring together people in one place at one time. And then throughout the year, we run individual events of all sizes and all kinds, in-person talks, online talks, competitions, challenges. There's a lot of discussions on the machine learning DL, information sharing. So the point of the community is to bring people together, give them a venue to share what they know. I think that's especially important in this area of machine learning and AI where knowledge is evolving so quickly. Today's talk from Cheryl is part of in a sense, a sub-series of sessions that we're doing this fall and winter around the intersection of design and AI. So this started last summer. We've had, I think this is the 6th talk we've held this fall, and we have several scheduled for early 2018. So there's a lot of people working in these areas that overlap design and AI as we learn how to integrate AI into our products and services. There's not necessarily a ton of canonical knowledge or completed projects that we have absolute learnings from, but I think a community is a great place to share ongoing learnings and insights as people are working and sometimes struggling, facing challenges, overcoming those challenges, and really doing the work on the ground. The talk is about 45 minutes today. At the end, we'll have some time for questions. If you're online, you can post the questions in the chat channel on ResNet, and I'll communicate those to Cheryl in the room. The talk's being streamed. It's also being recorded. That will be available within a few hours afterwards. And Cheryl will send me her slides, or we'll post her slides. The slide deck is 100 megabytes, so it's too big to send, but we'll post that so you guys can access the slides afterwards. One other note for those in the room, there's a big event happening next door in 1919. So the staff here has asked that once this session ends, you just leave and you don't go over into that area because the people in that room will be exiting at the same time that we are, and they just don't want that space is set aside for them, so they just ask that we exit quickly and move out of the building. So that's what it is. So you can gather in the lobby and talk more with Cheryl if you're still interested. So I'm going to hand it over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex and Ruth, for inviting me to this series. I've had really enjoyed catching up on the previous talks in this series, and it's an honor to come and talk to you folks today about it. It's a subject I'm very passionate about. So as was mentioned, I am Cheryl Platts. I am currently Senior Design Manager in C&E Studios, and I'm working on a new admin experience for a number of our enterprise and productivity products. But my background over the past decade or so has frequently crossed deeply with voice user interfaces. While I was at Microsoft the first time, I'm a boomerang. I first got into voice here working on Windows Automotive. I had the great pleasure of working with Lisa Stifelman during that time when Cortana was originally launching, and learned a great deal from Lisa and Shane over on the Cortana team. And then I hopped over to Amazon for a couple of years. I ended up as the first designer on the recently, well, not recently anymore, but the Echo Look, their sort of oddball project that is in the Alexa line, but it's a home fashion photography device with Alexa on board. And then I jumped over to the Alexa team to tackle some really great framework level problems like the Alexa notification system and a few of our third-party partnerships like Sonos and Ford. And then even prior to Amazon and Microsoft, my first experience with voice user interfaces was actually on the Nintendo DS on a game called Disney Friends. It was one of the first products on the DS to include voice recognition, and I learned a great deal even from that very small experience with 4 to 8-year-olds voice control and what boys are willing to say to Stitch on a DS. So I'm delighted to talk to fellow aficionados on voice and talk about the future. This talk originated at Webdagene 2017 a few months ago, and they asked me to come and talk about the future of voice design, or voice in general. And I was very conscious that I didn't want to jump too far into the future, because we are the people who will be shepherding these experiences in the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. It's not practical to just kind of make arbitrary guesses. I wanted to take a look at what we're not doing today and make some very concrete, actionable suggestions for where we need to go in the next 12 to 18 months, perhaps, to take voice to the next level. So humans have been developing the art of conversation for thousands of years. And as I'm sure most people in this room believe deeply, voice user interfaces are leveraging this experience to improve lives. They may have started out as a gimmick, but especially at Microsoft, with one of our pillars of accessibility, voice is transformational for so many folks. And we saw this on the Alexa team. If you just go and look at the reviews of the product, there are so many folks who couldn't really interact with technology in its previous form until voice showed up on the scene. And these accessibility benefits, again, at Microsoft, this is sort of preaching to the choir, but even though this benefits folks who might be vision impaired, all of us benefit, whether it is when we are unable to look at a device or because we are aging and our eyes will eventually fail us. Voice is future-proofing our own experiences for us in a way, in addition to changing the lives of folks who are dealing with constant disability. Anytime I needed motivation for why these were important problems to solve, I would go to the Echo review page and look for stories from folks who had seen this firsthand. And this one stuck out at me when I was performing the same task, putting the talk together. There was Michael Davis mentioned that his wife passed away 4 years ago, leaving him not only a widow, but a widowed quadriplegic trying to survive on his own. Alexa has been a blessing beyond my imagination. She has given me an opportunity that I never thought would be possible. This is perhaps an extreme case, but it's fundamentally changing a human being's life and providing them dignity and independence in a way that they would not have had without voice technology. We are at a tipping point, and 35.6 million Americans use a voice-activated assistant device at least once a month, and this is probably up because we've just passed Black Friday. In a few weeks, this will probably shoot up even more. But right now, the United States is still a flashpoint, and that's something that's really interesting about voice technology in general. I think Microsoft has always been a leader in globalizing the technology. You know, the Xbox shipped Connect in multiple languages at once. That was a huge challenge, a huge technology win. And Alexa approaches it from the complete opposite side of the spectrum, US first and then a trickle of additional countries. But right now, having spent time in other countries speaking on these topics, the United States is far ahead of the curve on voice UI adoption. And that's one of the challenges that sort of faces us is Microsoft has the ability to bring the rest of the world along more so than any other company I think, in this industry today. But the industry is far from mature. Voice UI is mainstream, more so in the US than perhaps the rest of the world right now. But in today's weaknesses lie 5 key opportunities for the future of voice UI. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. 5 concrete places where, from my personal experience and probably from your own experience as well, we're clearly falling short of what we could accomplish, and hopefully providing some inspirational paths forward should you be looking for the next innovation for your team, project, or life in general. So the first opportunity I want to talk about is the inherent bias intrinsic to today's voice user experiences. I think of all the points, this one will ring most true to Microsoft folks who are indoctrinated on the importance of accessibility and inclusiveness. But the limited training data available when most of these products were launched, especially in the culture of secrecy around, the Alexa launch, for example, and the affluent user base of most of these technologies, which are being marketed as Bluetooth speakers, essentially. They're not necessities, they are luxuries. These factors combine to create a risk of excluding underrepresented groups with inaccuracy. Dr. Cheryl Chapman from the University of Washington was quoted on KUOW KUOW earlier this year, talking about a study she performed with Siri. And she found, looking at race, I found that Caucasian speakers had by far the lowest error rate. African American speakers and speakers with a mixed racial background had higher error rates. And now this is just on Siri, but I suspect, based on personal experience and knowledge of how most of these products are launched, that this probably holds true for most of our products. And it's a small but concrete data point that indicates that we're failing a segment of our population, and probably multiple segments. This represents African American speakers and mixed racial backgrounds, but we know there's tons of regional dialects and other factors that influence voice UI accuracy. So to deconstruct those factors that are impacting our voice UI bias, we have gender. Systems were initially trained with internal data collection at most of these companies, and we know that even though we've come a long way, even in the most balanced engineering groups at Microsoft, it's approaching 25% female representation. And so if you're at Amazon or at Microsoft and you are limited in your pool to people who have signed employment full-time NDAs, you are not going to get a fully representative gender spread as hard as you try. And those that you do get probably won't give you enough of a matrix across these other elements. And I know my friends and I, it's mostly anecdotal, but I know I have a voice I need to use to interact with my Connect. I need to use my 80-year-old smoker voice a lot of the time. I'll ask, Xbox sign in Cheryl doesn't work, and then I've got to turn around and go, Xbox sign in Cheryl. And then it kind of, most of the time that will work. Not the most graceful thing, and a lot of my other friends have dealt with this, especially women. Now, I don't know if this is pitch-based or if it's the training pool, but I certainly see it in play a lot. And over time, the women or anyone who's underrepresented selects themselves back out of the pool. They stop using these devices. Ethnicity is another huge element here. Our representation of women at these companies is far better than our representation of a lot of minority groups, especially African Americans. And then training data expands early on to include early adopters who are often affluent. And again, we're excluding probably minority ethnic groups or groups in specific smaller represented accent areas and dialects. And so all three of these can combine intersectionally to provide a terrible experience for potential customers. And over time, this could lead to a bias spiral. The bias training data, when you launch a product, leads to the poor accuracy for these excluded groups. Some folks in these excluded groups may choose to experiment with the product, but they're going to have a horrible experience because we don't have the data that provides that high accuracy. And over time, especially because these voice interfaces tend to engender emotional responses, because we're human beings and we're trained to interpret voices in a different way than text input, those emotional responses to that poor accuracy more likely to lead to high attrition. And then when we get the high attrition, those customers no longer using our product leads to further bias training data because they're not using us in the first place. We can't trust that over time we're going to correct these problems if we're not intentionally going out and trying to fix the problem. We as designers, as technologists, must find a way to break this bias spiral and make the future of voice UI viable to all. The folks, and I think especially when we talk about accessibility benefits, many of the folks who are dealing with disabilities often represent part of those minority groups, they live in areas where their dialects might be different than what we're capturing. In order to fully realize an inclusive future, we have to be more intentional about seeking out these groups that wouldn't naturally have been included in these product launches. That's a huge challenge. And honestly, I think that we may not see full success doing this on a company-by-company basis. There may be an opportunity for us to come together as a community, as a technology community, and share training data across a wider set, perhaps an open source approach to voice training data, so that we can solve bias once and for all across multiple companies and get to solving the really complicated problems that require the additional technical expertise. But that's a huge opportunity that we have not solved today. The second opportunity revolves around the nature of today's voice user interfaces. We are mainstream, and customers are using these, but the types of tasks that customers are completing with these experiences are still very simple. And these individual voice experiences are highly siloed. And this leads to sort of a misallocation of resources on an industry level. And it prevents innovation. We have an ecosystem of voice assistants solving the same basic problems. Everybody can set a timer. And it's a frequent task. It's totally a valid task. But is it really a good use of resources for Cortana and Siri and Alexa all to solve this problem independently? Is that really benefiting industry or humanity to just a slightly different way to model these simple problems?
How can I help you?
I'd like to reframe this picture.
Cropping.
Make it square.
1-to-1 aspect.
Now flip it sideways.
Flip horizontally.
No, go back.
Undo.
I like it.
Committing changes.
So this is a fine vision of the future. I'll talk later about productivity in general, but the reason I bring this video up now, I know how many folks in the room are designers or work with one or more design tools. So a couple folks, about half the room, and probably a proportional amount of the folks online. You guys probably empathize with the challenge of keyboard shortcut drift across products, right? The shortcuts we use to zoom in and out in PowerPoint or to zoom in and out in Sketch don't always match the ones we use in Adobe or other products. If we continue to operate in a siloed fashion solving these voice UI problems, we may find that we experience the same keyboard shortcut pain point for key productivity tasks from assistant to assistant or voice system to voice system. Do we really want that kind of cognitive dissonance between shifting between products for our customers? That's not really solving anyone's problem. That's not bringing humanity forward. You're just going to be arguing with your system if the command for zoom in is different on Cortana than it is on Alexa. So how can we as an industry break down some of those silos and agree on a common semantic model for these tasks that we know are common, whether it's setting alarms and timers or whether it's some of those tasks that we know are coming down the pipe, potentially even something like photo manipulation. How can we create a semantic model that represents these tasks so that we're not redefining the wheel every time in every company? There are tons of complicated, high-value, very proprietary things we could be worrying about instead of trying to reinvent and innovate at the smaller atomic level of basic tasks. And furthermore, do we need one assistant to rule them all? The narrative, I think, there's sort of an implied narrative in media right now that, it's the voice assistant war and Cortana versus Alexa versus Siri throwdown. Is there really only going to be one winner here? Or is there actually room for multiple assistants that are better at different things? A company is not made up of one person. A company is made up of many people with different talents, all contributing in different ways. Why does it have to be any different when it comes to these voice assistants and voice UIs? We don't necessarily need a one-ring assistant. And honestly, in a world where we want freedom and we want the ability to walk away from a company if their goals change from our own, not being tied into a single assistant sounds like a pretty good option. And the great news is I'm very proud of both Microsoft and Amazon for experimenting with collaboration as opposed to competition. I don't know how this will land longer term, but I think this was a really fantastic move and very kind of non-traditional by Silicon Valley standards, where folks just basically compete until they die. Most folks here are probably familiar with this announcement from a few months ago, but Amazon and Microsoft have agreed to essentially on the back end allow their assistants to communicate. Cortana is much stronger at productivity tasks, integration with Outlook, integration with Exchange, and integration with Office, whereas Amazon's much stronger at home automation, home productivity like kitchen tasks and audio. So rather than reinventing the wheel, allowing those two systems to communicate, acknowledging that customers of one company are probably customers of both, and allowing both companies to focus on what they're good at seems like a win-win for everybody. We'll see. I look eagerly to see how this manifests over time, but I would like to see more of this. Each assistant can have strengths and weaknesses, and in a perfect world, they might even work together. there's room in the industry for more than one titan. So the quote from the New York Times, just to give the context, through its collaboration with Microsoft, Alexa users will get answers to some of the same questions that Cortana can now answer. For instance, when is the next budget review at the boss? And similarly, I believe we benefit from some of Amazon's stronger partnerships with, for example, smart home manufacturers, things that take a long lead time. Both companies can move forward. So let's build a choir of harmonious voice interfaces together. Let's find ways to specialize and complement rather than rebuilding a bunch of timers and not bringing humanity or our customers forward. So the third opportunity, today's voice UIs are not conversational yet. Essentially, the popular voice assistants allow only command and control scenarios. And it's interesting because you go out into sort of the conference circuit, and voice UI and conversational UI are conflated. And I think that it makes sense why folks kind of view them in the same bucket. But as someone who's worked on them, I don't view the interfaces I worked on for Alexa as conversational. I don't view a conversation as, hey, honey, turn on the lights. That's not a conversation. The conversation is so much more than that. And we have some experience with non-conversational interfaces. And the comparison has come up a lot, especially as we come into the productivity space again, and we start to put our toe over the line. Why did Clippy fail? Why did the industry react so strongly in the negative? Partially, it was because we weren't applying conversational metrics to Clippy's interaction. It just shoved things in our face instead of taking into consideration all of the other subtle cues that go into a give and take, an actual conversation. It was really just UI putting itself forward rather than a back and forth. A spoken conversation is far more than just words. Audible cues like tone, speed, and volume mean the difference between something polite and something brusque, between a happy completion of a task and somebody doing it just because they have to. And there are a number of physical cues which our user interfaces themselves may not manifest, but we could take into consideration, especially on a system like Cortana, where we probably have multiple inputs to consider, not just a microphone, but the camera that we're using for Windows Hello could also, if developed ethically, give us access to some additional information about how the customer is feeling and whether they're receptive to conversation in the moment. The Kinect, when it was released, the second Kinect, had the ability to determine heart rate just by looking at an individual. That could tell us whether or not someone is in a state of stress, whether or not they should be interrupted or not. At times, proactive interruptions are helpful, but there are times when they are not. If someone calls you while you are trying to merge onto an on-ramp, you will not be receptive to that communication. And so how can we take these additional cues into play to prevent another Clippy scenario as an industry, not just Microsoft?
Oh. Hi.
Hi. How you doing?
I'm well. How's everything with you?
Pretty good, actually. It's really nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you, too.
I'm sure many Microsoft employees hold this particular film in high esteem, and I believe Microsoft folks actually collaborated on some of the film itself, and assessing the feasibility of some of the plot and the manifestations of the technology. But here, this conversation between the device and the customer is very simple in words. There's not a lot of text there, back and forth. Most of the communication happens in pauses, in intonation, but it creates a sort of shared vulnerability between the device and the customer. And we don't paint with this brush yet. I think as someone who spent 2 years as a voice designer and sort of away from graphical interfaces, the external perception was that all we did was write words. And we need to get much further than just writing words. It is about what we don't say as much as what we do say. There would be no emotional vulnerability if Samantha, the AI in this clip, just blurted out a paragraph about who she is and what she does. That's fine for later. Conversation is about appropriateness and tact and judgment and absence of speech just as much as it is about the words. Conversation also requires trust. And humans build trust over time. If you think back to some of your friendships that you built in your youth, the conversations on the phone, or emails or Snapchats or whatever you did to build that trust back and forth, that doesn't happen overnight. But especially our current assistants essentially live in a state of near permanent amnesia. Cortana may be the best at trying to learn over time with her notebook and manifestations of a longer term relationship. But the way the two communicate does not, the two parties in these digital conversations does not inherently change. Even though Cortana knows things about you, she does not become more familiar. She does not drop extra words in her prompts. She does not change the way she approaches your conversation. So this is another dimension we need to add in if we truly want to be conversational. If we want to move beyond command and control, we have to understand how time impacts this relationship. But what benefits can humans gain from trusting these assistants? Trust is dangerous. I often tell folks who ask me whether or not they're permanently being listened to by their home digital assistant, their voice assistant, that it's good for them to continue to ask that question. They should always ask, question the motives of the company behind the technology, question that exchange of trust, be willing to take their trust back. But what can humanity gain if we do build a conversational interface that adapts over time, that manifests trust? This is another excerpt from a review of the Echo that maybe gives a glimpse. The other night, I found Gary playing his own version of a memory game with Alexa. He was trying to come up with songs he remembered and hadn't heard for a while, and would ask her to play them. This was a wife describing her husband's struggle with Parkinson's. And in this small example, this man who's struggling with a memory impairment, which is so fraught with stigma and struggle and loss of dignity, trusted the UI enough to find a way to test his memory and to find a way to get a little bit of humanity back in the moment. I believe this is a trust-based interaction here. This woman's wife, Alex's wife, or Alex's husband, rather, trusted the device enough to have a very vulnerable moment. And some of the opportunity around truly conversational UI and voice UI that we trust lies in these sorts of private moments. Many of you may be aware that Apple has publicly sort of announced or hinted at least that for Siri, they are trying to find a way to introduce a little bit more it's essentially psychology, understanding of psychology and how people work to address situations that come up frequently with Siri. This job posting mentioned that people have serious conversations with Siri. People talk to Siri about all kinds of things, including whether they're having a stressful day or have something serious on their mind. They turn to Siri in emergencies or when they want guidance on living a healthier life. We do have people around us who can provide us with some of this companionship if we're lucky, but many human beings around the world are lonely or they are isolated. Maybe not permanently, but maybe in the moment. You know, we struggle so much with mental health in this country, and the folks who are in their darkest times don't feel like they have a human they can reach out to. If they happen to trust their device and that helps them get through the night, when nothing else is there, that seems like we're bringing humanity forward. That seems like a responsible use of trust and conversational UI. The indication of willingness is there in the signals on what questions people are asking. They're not yet being answered necessarily. And this is with great power comes great responsibility. This is a very challenging space. And I don't mean to imply we should go lightly into this area, but humans are not, we often take for granted that loneliness is a part of the human condition. We are not always surrounded by other people. The other people around us are not always what we need in the moment. And if these assistants can provide companionship, whether it's to somebody who's dealing with Parkinson's or somebody who's dealing with depression or somebody who just wants to ask a couple of questions about weight loss without being judged, that is a valuable benefit of these conversational interfaces. And I think the voice component is very crucial because it changes our emotional connection to the conversation. If you just type something into a Facebook Messenger chat window, I don't think you can have a meaningful conversation about some of these topics without the parts of our brain that react to voice, that process it in a different way. This also comes up a great deal, especially if you work on one of these products. if you happen to work on Alexa or Cortana, you probably get this suggestion at least once a month, if not more frequently. I need a politeness mode for my device. My kids are being rude to my assistant. And I think that this is not a simple question. First of all, I do think that a lot of the parents asking for this don't realize that the politeness mode has to apply to them too, and they will be far more frustrated by it than their kids will be. And I'm hoping to build a talk around this very large concept, but this ties into the conversational piece. Building trust is a little bit about this politeness, this social contract back and forth. So how can the use of please and thank you, the use of whatever social metrics we have for indicating whether you're in a conversational mood, whether you trust the person you're talking to, how can these influence the conversation over time? And can we bring the human race farther forward if we do implement a politeness mode? What would that mean? Would we be raising better kids, or would it backfire on us and they think that politeness is just a game and not? How can we show genuine human benefit for treating others, whether they be digital or human, in a humane way? So this is just a big part of this conversational UI opportunity. But to solve this problem, we have to figure out what a relationship looks like. How do we ethically model that relationship over time without capturing too much information about our customers? What information do we save? What level of transparency and control? Cortana, with her notebook, is taking a step in that direction, but all assistants are going to have to figure this out for themselves. And then the big money Her question from the movie Her, does the assistant's personality adapt or remain fixed? Is it the same Samantha for everybody and you just need to pick a different device or assistant if you don't like it? Or does the device adapt over time, change its preferences, change its opinions? Most of these assistants are very careful about expressing opinions because it will exclude people. If they have a political opinion, that will remove the device from consideration for a number of folks. Is that the right way to go if we're truly trying to create conversational interfaces? Conversation is a lot about opinion and exchange in that way, but right now we're taking a very conservative approach. And then how does that politeness variable affect these interactions?
So how can I help you?
Oh, it's just more that everything just feels disorganized. That's all.
You mind if I look through your hard drive?
Okay.
Okay, let's start with your emails. You have several thousand emails regarding LA Weekly, but it looks like you haven't worked there in many years.
Oh, yeah. I think I was just saving those because I thought maybe I wrote something funny in some of them. But
Yeah, there are some funny ones. I'd say there are about 86 that we should save. We can delete the rest.
Okay.
Okay? Can we move forward?
Yeah, let's do that.
So there's a ton in this clip, but I feel like this is a wonderful indication of where we might be able to get if trust is deployed responsibly and ethically. And if you trust your device, you may be able to complete some of those productivity tasks that elude us today. If they didn't have that initial exchange where they got to know each other a little bit, would he really have responded in the positive to, can I look at your hard drive? I love that moment of pondering. It wasn't an instantaneous response. It's a lot. That's a very invasive question. And of course, this is a film, so that relationship probably needed to take more time before she asked if she could look at his entire digital fingerprint. But the potential is there that a trusting relationship between voice UI and the person who's using it could lead to better productivity over time. So these more honest revelations. But she also acknowledges his humanity here. He says, I thought some of them were funny. And she acknowledges that. She laughs, whether or not that was synthetic or not. You could have just bulldozed through the task, but instead there was a moment taken as part of that conversational trust to acknowledge a person's perspective and feelings in the moment. And so that's, to me, that's a very inspirational clip for where we could go if we did everything right in conversational UI. Fourth opportunity, the very strong segue, voice interfaces don't yet help us with complex work. It is still set the timer. You might be able to say set an appointment for tomorrow, but if it gets the title wrong, or if you want to set up a meeting with 3 people, God help you. The creative and creation tasks are almost uncharted territory, except for Dragon Naturally Speaking and dictation, but even those are very coarse-grained tools at the moment. Now, as far as visions for the future. This is a classic clip.
Move in. Stop. Pull out track right. Stop. Center and pull back. Stop. Track 45 right. Stop. Center and stop.
So this is a very interesting example from a long time ago. We still haven't gotten here yet, but it's interesting. He's not manipulating a mouse, but he's doing heavy image editing and enhancement tasks. In other parts of the clip, he's actually giving like grid indices and things like that. And in the most recent Blade Runner film, there's another example of voice operation of a drone. And one thing to take away from both of these is they're highly modal experiences, which is sort of one thing we have to grapple with when we start dealing with productivity tasks. There are a very limited number of words we can use for many of these situations, but the words mean very different things in different modalities. If we're looking at how to make our voice interfaces relevant in a productivity context, we need to grapple with the environment that our customer is in. Not all productivity tasks happen in secure or isolated spaces, especially with open workspaces. And this is a huge, Cortana has huge sort of adoption technically. It's available on, millions of desktops, but we don't hear a lot about people doing voice control on their machines in the mainstream. And I think the environment problem is a large part of the problem. Many of those tasks were developed for the phone, which can be used in a slightly more private context, whereas just talking to your device in an open workspace is not always tenable. We also have the problem of user-created taxonomies. It's fine when you're talking about command and control of an image where you know what people are trying to do. But as somebody who works on Azure and Dynamics and these large-scale enterprise systems, you can't reference user-created objects by name because they're unpronounceable. And so how do you, is voice even appropriate in these scenarios? Or are there other ways you can index and select an object from a customer's Azure infrastructure to complete a task? This is a big challenge. There's no guarantee that these names are acoustically unique or pronounceable, so you can't just layer voice UI on top. You need to come up with highly contextual and modal ways of manipulating objects. Maybe it's multimodal, where you select the object somehow manually and then start to perform tasks with voice. But if your hand's already on a mouse, why is the voice involved at all? And then, of course, there's trust and desirability. There's so little research in the area, we don't fully understand what tasks customers are willing to complete without visual confirmation, which habits are going to die so hard that people won't be willing to take the jump, and which tasks are rife for reinvention, which tasks are using graphical user interfaces as a crutch. I don't believe that all productivity tasks will be best solved with voice. Voice has strengths. Physical user interfaces and graphical interfaces have strengths, and we need to investigate more to see where the sweet spot is. But where can we start this voice productivity journey? One of the hypotheses I've developed looking into this for Azure and Server is to start by providing peace of mind with easy monitoring. Is everything on my team okay? What's changed? Were my backups successful last night? When things are okay, the benefit you've provided to the customer is peace of mind. And you've saved them time. They did not have to load a very heavyweight interface and navigate to a bunch of individual items to go verify that things are fine. If something isn't right, it'll take a long time for us to get to the point where you can solve that with voice. But at least then you've prevented the need to go to, say, the Azure portal until there's an actual problem. Now, you could ask why the device doesn't just greet you in the morning and tell you there's a problem. Excellent question. If customers are already in the habit of speaking to an interface, that's a great opportunity. But, in a situation where you're in a network operations center, it might be helpful to say, what area should I focus on right now? And have the system just tell you, focus on Asia right now, that's the highest latency. Great. Then I go focus my other efforts there. The other low-hanging fruit is low security scenarios, company-specific Q&A, and other things that are appropriate for use around coworkers. We can at least reduce friction on things like trying to find the address of a corporate building you're visiting to go give a talk or something like that, and save the graphical user interfaces for higher security scenarios where you just can't blurt out the responses to questions. And I just as a side note that has very little bearing on anything, when I was pulling this stock photography, I got endless delight out of the death glare from this receptionist right here. She does not want to answer your questions. She probably wants Alexa or Cortana to answer these questions so she can get back to the other work she's dealing with. But it's another low-hanging fruit. And I mention these low-hanging fruit because I think it's a much longer journey to get to a Minority Report style situation where you're completing destructive tasks with voice. I think we just don't have customer acceptance. It's just not so socially acceptable in the office. So we start with the low-impact scenarios, or the low security scenarios, and then hopefully we'll get signals back from customers about what's next, what would be next most helpful to them from a voice perspective. And the future's coming quickly. This came out yesterday. Alexa for Business was announced. And there are integrations with Microsoft Exchange, RingCentral, Salesforce, huge competitor for us, SAP Concur, SuccessFactors. Like this, it's going to take a while, but this is sort of an icebreaker. This might change the conversation from voice isn't appropriate to the workplace to why aren't we doing voice in the workplace? So we need to keep a very close eye on this, get ahead of the curve, and look for opportunities to find ways to enhance office productivity and take advantage of growing comfort with these more inclusive input modalities. Creator scenarios will come, but this road is a long one. And last but not least, multimodal interfaces are rare, and they are often inconsistently implemented. And I think a large part of the problem is our customer state is often tied to the input modality, so it's very hard to switch back and forth between touch and voice, or between devices. Our systems just weren't engineered in that way. And so there's a great opportunity when building new systems to build a platform-agnostic, device-agnostic, input-agnostic representation of your customer state, which allows them to choose whatever input modality they want at whatever time they want, which sounds horrifying when you look at some of today's systems, but we can at least make better decisions moving forward. Voice interfaces do change lives for customers who were not served well by visual UI, but we can't leave the deaf and others with auditory impairments behind in our march towards this new bold world. I don't think we're moving towards voice only. If you look at Star Trek Next Generation, which clearly inspired my slide design, they are a multimodal interface. They use voice for a lot of command and control, but there's certain tasks, like your ship's warp engines are failing, where you're going to need a screen also. And you're going to need the computer to be aware of what tasks you've completed on GUI, and vice versa. You're going to need the voice UI to be aware of what screen you're looking at when you perform a contextual task. Multimodality maximizes inclusiveness. And there's a couple modals or approaches to multimodality I've seen. One of them is sort of a hack, parallel multimodality, where you just provide separate interfaces. A lot of early cars did this. You had GUI, and then you had a voice user interface, but they did not talk to each other. So there were multiple input modalities, but it was an all or nothing choice, which was very frustrating when we were doing all the Windows Automotive assessments. When you see music or perhaps your contact list on the screen, but you're starting from scratch if you switch over to voice once the car starts at an intersection. But you might also, there are some cases where we might have to fall back on this for server scenarios where dealing with the accessibility problems of our existing server UI is so large that we're just going to have to add a separate input modality in parallel to solve their problems without pulling it down for everybody. Now, the real holy grail would be dynamic multimodality, allowing you to switch fluidly between voice, touch, or text input based on customer needs. And if your needs are all voice or all GUI, this works. And for those customers who have the ability to switch between modalities, this is extremely powerful. So like the most basic examples now are when you've got a conversational UI in a chat window that allows you to either input via voice or input via text. That's very rudimentary, but if you take Alexa and the fact that their Ford partnership is bringing them into the car, you need a system state that not only is multimodal, but device agnostic. And they understand what music you were playing at home when you transition into the car. But if your state is tied to a specific device, you can never realize that scenario. You have to engineer your system at a fundamental level differently to represent your customer's core state. And I know Microsoft is also innovating in this space. Some of the recent announcements about the groups in Windows in future releases, we're starting to represent this cross-device state. Maybe we can leverage it for voice UI as well. So Cortana, they're examples of dynamic multimodality, primarily manifest. This was some of the stuff I worked on when I was on the Cortana team, trying to indicate that in some cases, even though you started the flow with voice, you could drop over to touch if the corrections were too complicated for voice or just not convenient. In many cases, if she heard you wrong, repeating yourself is unlikely to yield a better result. If it's just a weird acoustic phrase, me repeating it another time is just going to lead to more garbled text. Better for me to touch it and correct it if I have the ability in the moment. And so they allow you to go back and forth in some ways there. Now, on the Echo, on Alexa platform, we have the Echo Show. This is sort of dynamic multimodality. And for the most part, many tasks you complete with Alexa have to be started with voice. There are a few core tasks you can do from the home screen, but most of them still need to be launched with voice. But once you started the task, there is support for touchscreen interactions like here with search results. That's something that voice really doesn't do very well. If you've ever tried to listen to contact matches in a car, you know what I mean. Certainly narrating this list of results, if you have a screen available, it may be more efficient to let folks just drop down to touch, especially if we know they're near the device. You know, if we can take other inputs into account and adapt dynamically based on what we think is probably most useful. Have they touched the screen any time in the last 10 minutes? You can get really smart if you want. So that's, if you're designing for multimodal systems, you need to remember that these are highly contextual systems. And the more you can take into account, the better. Customer's most recent input mode, time of day, current location, ambient noise levels. This will all influence their most likely response modality to you. Centralized state is important because they may be switching back and forth between, we know our voice system may be an entirely different set of servers and systems than our graphical user interface, but they need to share state so that we can go fluidly back and forth. And adaptive content is also important. What you display in a conversational UI or on a screen is not the same text that you necessarily want to speak to the customer. You may, in the spoken prompt, want to cue specific words that you want the customer to say back. You may be more brief in your spoken prompt because you know they're also looking at the screen. So having, and this is a big unsolved problem. I don't know if I don't really think anybody's really nailed adaptive content. This may be researched for years, how we can write prompts without writing prompts. Is this synthetic prompt generation where the system in the moment is figuring out how to word the response based on core data? There's all kinds of interesting questions here. So, in closing, how do we get to the future of voice UI? We want the future of voice lies in inclusive and unbiased speech recognition, cross-product partnerships, and a semantic web that prevents us from reinventing the wheel and allows the entire industry to benefit from where we've gone before. Customers shouldn't have to relearn a language for interacting with every individual assistant. We should have a shared language for common tasks. Trust built over time with shared content, so you can get to that her scenario where, can I look at your hard drive? Yeah. That takes time and trust. Flexible input and output modalities in real time, not just I'm either using voice or graphical, but the enterprise scenario, not enterprise business, but this, the Star Trek, Starship Enterprise, where you can modify your output in real time and the system reacts. And support for voice-enhanced productivity tasks. Maybe we aren't replacing graphical user interfaces for productivity, but finding ways to make people more productive with voice when it's available, because we know our systems are capable of it now. We know our systems are shipping with probably far-field voice recognition in addition to camera input. So how can we enhance human productivity? These advances will combine to open new opportunities and a new era in human empowerment. Enhanced productivity, use that word intentionally, enhance. Multimodal adaptivity, whether that be in the car or your home or your device or all three for a single task. Inclusion and companionship from the young to the very old, finding ways to help when these devices are around and humans are isolated. How can we bring them into the fold, or how can we help them get through difficult moments?
Please. Computer? Computer? Ah. Hello, computer.
Just use the keyboard.
The keyboard. How quaint.
I love this clip so much. I always loved this movie most, and I didn't realize it was like foreshadowing for the work I would do in the future. But what I love about this is that he's not impaired. Like he has no learned helplessness. He still knows how to complete these tasks if he has to with the graphical interface. It's the look on his face when he's forced to drop back to something that he feels is less productive. Let's move to and build a future of voice interfaces where humanity is amplified and not atrophied. Thank you very much for your time. May the voice be with you.
So what I found out with the voice, it is great, voice input is great, but at night when the rest of the people are sleeping, it's annoying.
Yeah, that's a great point. The observation from the audience was that voice is fine as long as the rest of your house is not asleep. Yep, that's an interesting challenge, especially with far field. You know, if you have a phone, you can sort of take your voice down and talk to the phone, but my bedroom echo is, 8 feet away, so it can be a little bit awkward. And I think that's a great point. Now, even though these home assistants are changing lives, there are still situations where you prefer other inputs, and there's no reason we can't adapt and allow both of those worlds instead of treating these as separate systems. Or we just learn to use sign language to our echoes and other voice assistants, but that seems like farther to. I think there was a question here.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering because you had talked about the types of tasks that customers are using it for, and that tend to be more simple, and identifying ones where we can find value. And I'm wondering sort of, what's your plan of attack for that? Like, how would you recommend sussing out what those areas are?
It's a great question. The question is around a plan of attack for figuring out what areas are best identified as voice enhanced in a productivity space. For me personally, when looking at the space I work in now, in servers and enterprise, some of it is a little ad hoc. It's piggybacking onto other user studies and either assessing how folks are using voice interfaces in their life outside of the office, or I've been experimenting with conversational UI as kind of a first step, since voice is not really generally adopted in most of these enterprises. Like if we start with chatbot-based interactions and use those to assess what people are most comfortable communicating with an agent with conversationally, and then building voice on top of that, that might be a way to go. Of course, part of the question is like, how many resources do you have available to you? But I think, I've been... there's a couple of Kai papers that we were looking at. There's some other opportunities out there. And I think one of the things I'm doing when I'm going out and speaking is trying to get the academic community involved in this, because I don't think, like, we're so focused on product releases and already identified opportunities that I don't think we can answer those questions alone. And I'm really hoping that we can all inspire our partners in academia to go and research these questions and do the generative work. And then we can pick up the ball once we've identified that there is an opportunity or that customers are interested in a particular type of voice interface for productivity. But we can always use accessibility as a sort of excuse as well. Excuse is the wrong word, but because our company in particular is so focused on accessibility, we can ask our customers who are most constrained what they need, and then build out from there. Like, is what they need also what our other customers need? Maybe we can solve multiple problems at once. And I think that's going to be big on the server space. Yes?
So the first good news is that if you want your academic partners to join, you're in the best place, because this building is more academic than most academic institutions, in a good way. I have a couple comments/questions. The one is the one thing that you haven't spoken about, and so we can park these and figure out which one you want to answer, but is symmetric versus asymmetric voice, where one party's speaking and the other one's not, or the one's listening, or vice versa. So translator,
right.
When I'm speaking, it does captioning of the speech in one way and text the other, but there's lots of scenarios for that, which are very different.
That's a great point.
A second thing is, I question your, I get what you're saying, and I agree with it really strongly. I'm curious if there might not be a stronger way to get it. On a previous slide, you had parallel multimodal versus dynamic. And I'll take two examples, one of which you know really well, and the other one which I suspect you know really well, that illustrate that parallel for me is where you are using both modalities simultaneously in a single utterance. And you didn't address that, and it's the biggest gap in anything that pretends to be intelligent conversational stuff. In 1977, Richard Bolt and the team at MIT did a system called Put That There. Now they did this with over-the-counter purchase technologies and no new technology whatsoever. And you could do something and have a screen bigger than that, somebody remotely sitting, use a gestural interface, and then put up a map, and you can say, move that, that red ship there, which is, that gesture is called a directed gesture, and it's a directional pronoun.
And we desperately wanted that in Windows Automotive.
And none of the speech systems, no matter how clever they appear to be, can resolve a directional pronoun. And so they're not smart, they're not conversational, and we cannot speak without using our hands.
I think that's a fantastic point. And honestly, that last point I just added to the talk, so I think if you're okay with it, I want to expand on that next time.
I'll give you some slides.
Oh, great!
But that's the one that would be parallel, and as opposed to sequential. Now the sequential ones, we have two really good examples. One is the car, where when I take my phone and I've got modern or metro, whatever you want to call it, but basically eyes and fingers on the phone as the interaction language. When I'm driving, if I'm using that, I should use my driver's license. There is a 100% change in interaction language when you're driving your car, right? And then that's sequential. The modality changed seamlessly, and it changed according to context. What happens in the car is the epitome of that's the ideal of how things should adapt as my activity is mobile and I traverse in a changing environment.
And I think you may have come across better cars than I have, because I agree with that future vision. Admittedly, a couple of years ago when I was working on it, what I saw was the seat switching wasn't yet seamless, and so it really was either or. Like if you...
No, it really is, it's a binary switch, but it's better than anything else in the market, practically. But the other example is an accessibility, voice and accessibility within Windows. It's been there forever versus the mouse input. And what's interesting is that we've always had parallel modalities. They've just been so foreign, and the transaction cost to switch modality was so high that most people don't even know that if they broke both their arms, they could still do the work. And they could have already in NT or before. And so we separate the accessibility side of things from the use of this language, and none of the work on Cortana or any of the work in speech in this company, to the best of my knowledge, other than the translator, is directed at takes into account and integrating and replacing the accessibility stuff.
That's fantastic.
And that redundancy, again, sort of says we may have AI, but we don't have very much intelligence in our approach to the use of language and speech. And so there we already have sequential, but the ability to move from one to the other is critical. So it's the dynamic nature of being able to transition. How seamless is the transition from one to the other? That's what you're talking about.
The transitions being
so it's the seamlessness of transitions and the ability to work in parallel when the resources are there. But I cannot go to a touchscreen, a Surface Hub, which has Cortana running on the same processor, and say, Cortana, what is this? And again, because we're so obsessed with AI, when we talk about how clever we are, we don't realize that we've missed the boat.
As we're building the vocabulary, pun intended, I think there's a mismatch. The notion of parallelism that Cheryl was speaking is a compartmentalized one.
Yes.
You're talking about more of sensor fusion in terms of you have all these few streams of input that they shouldn't been listened to at the same time. Whereas this parallelism is a draconian one that
isolated systems. Okay. And maybe that's the right way for me to phrase this.
Right, and so that's why I mean that's sequential. So the parallels that you're talking about is I need to be able to switch from one to the other whenever appropriate.
Yes.
So I need parallel implementations.
Even no, I'm talking that, you know, I come from South America. When I speak, my hands move without me thinking.
Yeah, yeah.
You should not only listen to my voice, but see my hands. It's not just you switch from my voice to my hands. It's all one package.
For sure.
It sounds like we might have
same
to.
as pointed there.
Sounds like we should probably continue afterwards. I want to get some other.
I didn't mean to give a talk. But there's. It's just that these aspects that you're touching on, and I really thank you for because you did it really well, are key. And if you don't hammer even harder, I'm just encouraging you to hammer harder.
Thank you. No, I want to continue this conversation.
Otherwise, we're just going to keep trying to make something
the same thing.
The same thing, but doing better.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And that's not where we need to do the work. And the point is, if we rely on the people who work on speech and AI, from the engineering perspective, we're going nowhere. And that AI cannot succeed without balanced, an equal investment and an equal dependence on the design side of things. That's the message.
Thank you. Yes.
You came late to the talk, so apologies if you treated this before. I'm curious as to how your thought has evolved into what should be behind the voice. And we've been in meetings like this. Should it be a person, Alexa? Should it be a system that is not expected to behave in human or have human characteristics? What's your opinion on this?
My opinion. I think, going back to the probably overused quote I mentioned earlier, with great power comes great responsibility. Like, my opinion is that there are greater gains to be had from systems that communicate in a humane way, but that if you build that trust and abuse it, the damage is much greater as well. You create a vulnerability that can be exploited. Like, there's an example in one of my Medium posts about a kid's toy in Germany that had the capability to record children's conversations. That's an abuse of trust. And in those cases, you can kind of extrapolate, like if one of our assistants built that trust and then started recording us in a horrible way or using our information in a bad way, it might damage the whole industry, and all the benefits to folks for this accessibility and changing lives could be lost. Because we're still we're almost mainstream, but especially with the general public's concern about the sort of antagonistic power of AI, it's dangerous. And so I actually am more interested in the psychological sort of humane conversations, but at the same time, I agree with what I think Microsoft's general perspective is right now, which is to be cautious, like not to create 16 different personalities. And in many cases, your conversational agents don't need to pretend to be human, especially if it's a really constrained task. So it's like I kind of see a yin and yang. If there's the sort of companionship element of long-term sort of OS level assistance, and then there's the task-based assistance, which probably shouldn't try to pretend to be anything they're not. But I don't know if that accurately answers your question, but I'm both attracted to and repulsed by the power of the sort of humane connection and the trust we could have in assistants that use human social contracts. Yes.
So I'm in the analog engineering team, working on the speech platform, and I think with HoloLens we've started to address some of these multimodal kinds of problems. And I really appreciate sort of the optimistic, grand, unified sort of landscape that I think you're playing. But I guess my comment is, as a practical way to make forward, I've seen engineering teams make more progress as they try to address one customer at a time, and not try and do all of them, but try and solve one customer's problem, right? And I think that also came out in your talk, right? These really powerful individual stories of individual humans who needed specific solutions. And I guess my comment is really that we need to do both, right? We will get to the grand unification as we maybe solve one problem at a time. In a customer situation, that's a problem.
I agree with you, and I think this talk is really broad scope, and I think an entire team could be spun up on multiple opportunities within each of the 5 ideas. Like, there's so much work to do. But I also get a lot of folks approaching me, especially from academia, like, where do I start? And so it's like, here's a bunch of big questions. pick one maybe and work on that. But I agree in principle, like I'm all about doing what we have to make progress. Yes?
So a lot of the things that you talked about and it touches the personality thing is meant for one-on-one communication, one person. And we know that there are a lot of situations like there's a family, right? And there are, I don't know, 4, 5, 3 different people in the household. Each one of them has their own proclivities. Each one of them likes to be treated differently, will respond to things differently. And of course, we can talk about kind of larger situations with more people, especially in the workplace. So I wondered, what are your thoughts about that? And when we're talking about personalities, even if we have like one personality, I mean, us as humans, when we're interacting with different people, we're doing
we change and adapt,
ways, right? To communicate better, to get our points across, etc. So how do you see that playing in the voice space?
It's a very interesting question, and I remember when I was working on Alexa, I was really excited by the fact that this was the first device that, being far field, that it could even have multiple conversations at once reasonably, or like have multiple people inputting at once. But I found we kept kind of stepping back in practice from dealing with multiple users at once because it then ended up being so technically complicated a lot of the time. I think going back to that yin and yang thing, if we're developing an assistant to evolve over time and build trust, I think it will have to kind of adapt a little bit. And if it knows that one of the parents in the household prefers a more formalistic sort of transactional structure for conversation, and the other's really sort of off the cuff and a bit brusque, maybe in a perfect world, and I think this is longer off, maybe it adapts a little bit, or can, without changing that core. Like in essence, we're kind of like asking ourselves, what is the core of personality? What variables can be changed dynamically? And what, if we change it, will cause our assistant, the illusion of life in our assistant to fall apart and to break that trust? And it's tough. I don't have an answer for that. But I also think that it's way too complex to make every assistant, every voice UI adapt for every person. And I think especially in productivity scenarios, will probably be better served by sort of streamlining and just doing one UI that gets out of the way as much as possible, and leaving that larger, fun, conversational and personality element to the longitudinal digital relationships. Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. This was really good. Actually, I'm from the engineering team in India, and some of the challenges that I could resonate with in your talk was about the first one, where currently it's for a very niche segment that we are working for, whereas voice is becoming big for everybody. For example, in India, what we are trying to do there is democratizing how people use mobile phones, right? So one of the changes that's happening because of the internet penetration and the huge number of people who are getting phones, they are not the people who have seen a computer. They are not the people who have ever used a keyboard. They do not know the spellings of the things that they are searching for, right? So in that case, what happens is that they are using the voice to even browse through YouTube catalogs. They're using voice to search for the most basic of things. And that's a challenge for us. How to tweak our AI systems, like the Indian languages, there are actually 15 to 20 languages in India. And how can we make sure that when people are talking to their phones, we recognize what they're trying to do and do it at the best possible way, so that democratizing what we are doing with speech is one of the big challenges. And yeah, I think that's a big problem for us.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm really glad to hear we're working on that problem. And I feel like of all the companies out there, Microsoft is best positioned to solve it. And I'd love to hear more about, like, are folks switching between dialects dynamically? Because I know that's a big problem when you launch in, say, Germany or France or something like that. There's still like this crossover with English where certain terms are English, but the systems are very much specialized for the languages that they were built on. And there isn't, there is no seamless transition between dialects or languages.
Just to add, Amazon Echo actually just launched a few months back. Google Home is coming in, but still they are very niche. They are going to go out to a very metro crowd. Whereas there is a huge population out there over the next few, actually 6 months to a year, who are going to use voice like as the first way in which they interact with their mobile phones. So that's becoming big, and that's something that we work on.
I can't wait to hear what your team. Please keep me up. If you have to come out with papers or anything, I'd love to read them.
Yeah,
Yes.
just want to kind of relate to this question that you mentioned early on that US is right now is ahead in the adoption of voice UI. From what you've seen, is it because of cultural reason or because of technology?
It's a technology problem. I mean, and so I think there's perhaps there's probably better data that can prove or disprove this, but my perception is, there's a general sort of use of mobile phone technology for voice searching and things like that, and it's gotten very high in the States, up to like 50% of teenagers do voice search once a day or something like that. But I think a lot of it still wasn't mainstream until these far-field devices came into play, because there was still the friction of clicking several times to open up an app to listen to me. And, once my hand's on the phone, is voice really the best way to do it anymore, especially when we're so adapted to typing? The far-field chips in some phones have also helped with that adoption. So I think far-field in general has shifted it, but there's phones with far-field chips generally available. And then there's the home assistant sort of category, which is very kind of still limited to the United States for the most part. As we've heard, there's a couple of European countries that have gotten both Google Home and Alexa, and now probably I assume that the Cortana devices shipped in multiple territories. But then, Japan and India just came on board with Alexa. But, it's been a slow slog. I mean, 2014, 26, what year is that when? It was 2014 when the Echo came out. And we're only just seeing, because Amazon's goes US first, and they were sort of leader in the industry, it went slow. I'm sad the Connect didn't take off more, because I think we could have helped with this problem. But so largely it's because people couldn't buy these devices in other areas, and if they could, I've heard about what people do to VPN some of these Echo devices, and it's complicated. And normal consumers would not do that, and then we get a bias spiral. So yeah, I'm hoping the acceleration will continue so that we see wider adoption. But going to Europe, it's still very much like they know they need to be prepared for voice, but it's not mainstream there just yet. Probably have time for one more question if anybody has one. Thank you so much, especially it's great to see friendly faces in the room, but thank you to everybody online. You can find me on Twitter at MuppetAphrodite and also on Medium. I post about these topics fairly regularly. I love people reaching out with stories about what they're working on. I would love to keep in touch with anyone who's doing voice work at Microsoft. And not all voice work is going to be on dedicated voice teams. Like my team is not dedicated to voice right now, but I think long term, designers will and technologists in general will pick up this competency just like we did mobile and responsiveness. It's not going to be something for a few folks in a corner on an ivory tower. This is something that we're all going to have to deal with in our daily lives in technology, and I look forward to continued conversations. Thank you.